Okay.
All right, folks, I want to welcome our guest tonight. It is none other than Will Jevning. Welcome to the show, Will.
Oh, thanks for having me on. Much
Absolutely,
appreciated.
man. It's my pleasure. I've been excited to talk to you. I know we've had to reschedule a couple of times, so I definitely appreciate you being amicable on your schedule. So I want to get right into it, man. You've been in this Bigfoot thing for so long and have this wealth of knowledge. But let's start off with what got you interested in this. And let's talk about your personal encounters and what happened to you that led you down this path that you've been on for so many years.
Well, let's see. Next month it'll be 49 years I've been connected to this subject, and it wasn't by choice. Um, I was all of 14 back in 1972, December to be specific. Um, and I know that from tracing it back to an old TV guide. And I'll get into that a little bit, but um, that's that year. And our parents, way back when they weren't catering to the kids like they do these days. If you wanted to go someplace, they'd say, "Well, guess what? Figure it out." You know what I mean? We lived in a very rural area, mostly farms, and if you wanted to go to a buddy's house, what you had to do was you rode their bus home with them on a Friday, stayed the weekend, and then rode back to your own Monday afternoon. So my buddy Mark came over to spend the weekend, and it snowed that week, so we couldn't really find a whole bunch of stuff to do at my place. So we said, well, let's go over to John's place. Our friend John Adams, he lived just maybe half a mile as a crow flies or less. And normally we'd go through the stand of woods. We had a trail, but with snow on the ground, we couldn't find the trail. So we decided to walk down the road and then to the railroad tracks, and the railroad tracks cut right over in front of John's house. So that was kind of a sort of a direct route to go. So we walked down, nothing unusual happened. We get about 3/4 of the way along the railroad line to John's house. We were almost there. And now everything is covered with snow, except the rails were bare. And up ahead of us, we could see something, everything was kind of black and white, in the winter and, with snow on the ground, how it looks. And we see something red between the rails. So we walk up there and we find this pile of animal intestines lying between the rails. And we're thinking, what the heck? How did this get here? And it was a little bit large. I mean, it wasn't small like a squirrel or anything like that. It was like from a medium sized dog. It was, a fair amount. And we're kind of scratching our heads thinking, well, shoot, there's no tracks of any animals the way we came. We can see to our right out in this open field. There's nothing out there. So I said, hey, you walk ahead on the tracks and I'll climb this little embankment to the left here. And I got up there and there's footprints all over the place. And I hollered for him to come up here and look. And we're standing there looking at these tracks. Now, you remember, we'd never heard the word Bigfoot. This was 1972. There still wasn't a bunch of information out there about this. And I didn't watch a lot of TV. I was outside all the time and I hunted and fished and stuff like that. So I was a real outdoors person. And we're standing there. We see these footprints are big. They're like human-like tracks, but they're big. They're probably a foot and a half long. And we're kind of scratching our heads thinking, well, who the heck is out here that's got that big a foot barefoot in these, minus 20, or no, it was less than 20 degrees out, in these temperatures. And then it dawned on me, I thought, wait a minute, the intestines down there aren't frozen yet. And it was cold. I think it was around 17 degrees. It should have been frozen. So immediately I knew whatever put them there was still pretty close by. And it just happened. So that scared us. We took off running. So we get to John's house, and like I said, Mark and I were 14, and John's our age, and he's got two younger brothers and two younger sisters. So there's a whole living room full of these kids and just pandemonium, right? And his dad comes out from the back of the house, and he's like, boys, settle down, knock it off. What's going on?" So we tell him what we found, and he grabs a 45 pistol and a camera, and he says, "Take me back out there and show me what you found." So this whole gaggle of kids goes out, with John's dad, and he's a retired Navy serviceman, so he's no nonsense. And we show him, and he's taking some pictures, and on all of us, we destroyed, I think, most of the tracks. All these kids wandering around in the snow, and but there were still some left. And he starts telling us what he thinks made these tracks, and we're just standing there stunned, because we like monster movies as kids and stuff like that. And the thought of having real monsters in our woods just wound us out, and I don't know where he got his information, probably True Magazine or one of those, from back then, Argosy or one of those. And so we go out looking every weekend, trying to see what made these tracks. Never saw anything again. So, you're that age, and, we did sports in school, stuff like that, baseball and basketball. So you kind of forget about stuff like this, right? Fast forward 2 years, 1974, and this is in the fall. I don't remember exactly when. The first incident I knew because, and it's funny because whenever I go over to John's place, they always had American Bandstand on television on Saturdays, right? And that was on, and there was a song by Johnny Nash called I Can See Clearly Now. And I liked that song. And I was able to go back just a few years ago and look up an old, there was some source, you can find anything online, right? And there was a source out of Seattle that had that TV guide for that weekend when he was aired, and it was December 16th, 1972. So I was able to pin down that date. But this incident, I don't know, it was probably October because in Washington, in that part of Washington, Puget Sound area, the weather was kind of predictable every year. So by October, that was hunting season for deer. So I knew this very clearly, when it freezes, that's your best time to hunt because the leaves are off the trees and things like that, right? So the leaves are off the trees and it had been frosty. And right at dusk, my collie, we had to tie him up at night because he liked to roam the neighboring farms and get in trouble. So we had to tie him up at night. And he was barking like crazy at the nearby tree line. There was a tree line maybe 100 feet from our barn. And I was always told by my dad, if there's some animal comes in the yard, go shoot it because it's probably rabid. And there was lots of stuff that come in the yard, skunks and raccoons, all kinds of things. So I grabbed a 22 and a couple of bullets, grabbed the dog. I said, go get him. Off we go, right? And he gets to the tree line and he freezes. And I'm walking towards him thinking, what's that dog doing? Never seen him do anything like that. So as I get closer to him, his ears are on high alert. He's really rigid, staring at the end of the tree line. And he always run headlong at things, never, backed away from things. So he came running back past me and I'm looking at the dog thinking, what the heck's he doing? So he runs back to the house. He jumps up on our back porch and I can see him from where I'm at sitting there shivering. I thought, what the hell? So I walk up and I'm thinking to myself, well, he'd gotten a pretty good mouthful of porcupine quills before. So I figured maybe he learned his lesson, right? Didn't want to tangle with a porcupine again, which that's what killed him eventually because he got into it again. But I walk up there and I can hear something moving inside the tree line. Now it's starting to get dark, so light's not great, but I can still see fairly well. And I put a round in the chamber and there's some low hanging fir trees, branches there, some dug fir. And there was a big maple tree inside the tree line. So I knew there was a clearing in there. So I had to push my way through the tree limbs. And as I entered this clearing, next to this big, and the maple tree is probably 3 feet thick. It's a big old tree, right? Is this massive creature standing to the left of the tree, and it's moving the leaves with its right foot. And instantly I'm just flooded with a ton of things, just all going on simultaneously in my head. I'm thinking, what in God's name is this? Only that wasn't the words that came to mind. It was the proverbial underwear changing moment. And then it dawned on me, oh, this must have been one of the things that made the footprints. Now, we'd found 3 sets of tracks that first day in 72. And there was just the singular creature. And I was just, I was stunned. I mean, it scared the hell out of me. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? How am I going to get away from this? Because I've come up face to face with black bear and stuff in the wilds growing up. And, you're lucky if you get out of a close encounter like that without some kind of an issue. So I thought maybe if I shoot in the air, it'll scare it away, right? So I shoot in the air, it didn't. And now when it saw me, it just stopped moving and glared at me. And then I shot, it didn't move. And I thought, oh crap. Then I hear this noise over here to my right rear. And I kind of glance over and here's another one come walking out from behind some brush. And it's slightly smaller than the first one. It walks over and stands next to the first one. and I just took off running. That was it. I'd had it. That was my breaking point. And we got made fun of by my parents and sisters about the footprints. And I sure wasn't going to say anything about this. So I quietly called John on the phone and I told him what happened so nobody could hear me. And we agreed we were going to meet at my place early the next morning before daylight. And we'd track whatever it was, see if we could figure this out. So they came over. There were 5 of us with our hunting rifles, and we tracked it in the frost for, God, at least a couple of hours until the sun came out and melted all the frost and the trail was gone. So, we didn't talk about it openly. John and I would talk quietly sometimes. And this one particular time, and it was after, I would say February or March of 75. We were on an activities bus. John and I, we'd stay after, to do sports. And, where we lived, there was maybe 6 kids on the whole bus, right? So we were spread out pretty good. And John and I were talking quietly about this. And this other friend of ours, Jim, he come over and Jim was a nice guy, but he was really short and didn't have any friends and kind of an introvert, so a nice guy, but he was kind of a loner. And he come over and he says, "Well, can you tell me about that? Can I interview you about that?" And I thought, I don't want to tell anybody about this, but I thought, I know Jim. I've known him for a long time. It's not going to go anyplace. He'll write it down in his journal and it'll be buried somewhere someday. So I told him. So a week or two later, he comes and he gives me these 3 books written by a guy named John Green. And I'm looking at these books thinking, wow, I didn't know there was so much stuff written about this. So I spent a few months poring over these books, and I don't know if it was July or August, but it was in the summertime. And I remember it was an overcast day. And in Washington, you get overcast days in the summer sometimes, which is kind of a bummer, but it happens. And I guess I was napping or whatever, 17-year-old growth spurts or something. So I was sleeping in the middle of the day. And one of my sisters comes and she says, "Hey, there's 2 men here to see you." And I kind of wake up thinking, 2 men? I don't know any men. The only men that come around are my dad's friends and my uncles. So I slide on my barn boots and I go walking out the back door. That's where all the people came to our house, was at the back door. It's where the driveway was. So I see, and I recognize him from Green's books. There's Rene Dahinden. And the other man was Dennis Gates from Cedar Woolley, who was also a Bigfoot investigator. And I was kind of shocked. I'm thinking, wow, this guy's in books. He's world famous, And back in those days, that's what you thought. You saw somebody book, they were famous, right? So he introduces himself and tells me why he's there. So I tell him what I saw. And he says, "Well, listen, John Green's just north of here a few miles. This is where our camp is. Why don't you come and, meet Green and hang out with us for a while?" And I said, "Okay, sure." So I called a buddy of mine. I didn't have a car, so I called a buddy and I said, "Hey, this is what's going on. Let's go." And he says, "Okay, I'll be over." And we spent a couple of days with Green and Dahinden and a bunch of the local people, including a state trooper by the name of Mark Pinninger, who had seen the same creatures I did, but he saw all 3 of them. And so that's how I got my entry into all this.
It's a crazy story in and of itself to come face to face with a Bigfoot, but then to have these people show up at your house and you get to go hang out and talk to Rene Dahinden and John Green afterwards is just even more surreal to me. And I've heard your story before, but every time I hear the retelling of the story, I feel like I'm there with you, because there's very few people that I've interviewed, and I've interviewed tons of people, as I know you have, that actually get that close and up close and personal with these things. It's usually a passing, fleeting moment, or it's a roadside
Right.
crossing, or whatever the case may be. But to be that close and to be able to recount that story to people like Rene Dahinden and John Green is amazing to me. And I know you got to spend some time with them, and I've always been curious. There's a lot that goes around in the Bigfoot world about what this person thought about that, or what this person thought about this, or where they came down on this subject. Well, you spent time with John Green and Rene Dahinden. Where were they on the subject at the time, and how did you see where they were on this Bigfoot thing progress as you come to know them?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, of course, from my own experience and then reading the accounts in Green's books, And then it was interesting observing Green and Hendon. They were like night and day, the two guys, right? Green stayed in his travel trailer and never really, he talked to the locals. He was more kind of a politician type. And being kind of an outdoorsman, I spent the nights with the Hendon and Gates, walking the roads. They had rifles and they were going to get one. And I knew at any minute, one was going to pop out and I was going to get scared to death all over again. But I thought I was with these guys. They're the experts. Um, it's interesting that the two of them, their outlook at that time, and it wasn't all that long after Patterson got his film, so it was still kind of their mindset was to engage the scientific community. That's what they wanted to do. They didn't want to prove it themselves. That wasn't their goal. Um, Up until the time Patterson got his film, their goal was to get the scientists to pay attention so they could hand it off and go away. It was interesting to them, but they weren't in it to cross any finish line. Wasn't their interest. Um, and I think over time they got kind of dispirited by the way things went because, science didn't really want to pay attention to it. And then a lot of the crazy people began to come out. There were a few out there back then, and Renee was really good for having me stay in contact with these people because, like Eric Beckjord, if you know anything about Eric Beckjord, the guy was crazy as hell. I mean, he was nuts. He would have me contact these people so we could gather information from them on what they were saying and doing. So he was kind of like the CIA. He would gather all kinds of information. But that was kind of where they were. I mean, I don't think they ever really, either one of them ever really progressed past that line of thinking.
And so let's fast forward to you. You had this experience. You spent this time with two of the legends in the Bigfoot community. How did your timeline? How did your progression play out in the Bigfoot world? What was next for you? Did you continue to hunt for answers? And I know you've written, I think you're on your 9th book now or starting your 9th book. So
Yeah, I'm starting my 9th one now.
talk about what that progression looked like for you and what that journey has looked like for you along the way.
The whole subject, it just would eat at me about answers. It wasn't something I wasn't out to go out and prove they were out there and all this stuff. It was like, I wanted answers, and the more things that would get answered, the more questions seemed to come up. So unfortunately, some things can draw you in, but you have to let the evidence lead you. A lot of people, and I'd say most of them in this subject, have sort of their own ideas about it. And then all the evidence seems to have to support what they think, or they don't buy it. You know what I mean? Instead of following the evidence where it leads you. So initially, now after Green and Hendon left, went back to British Columbia, I almost felt like it was my duty, because they asked me to be their eyes and ears in that region. So here we are, in high school, and my buddies and I, we all get together, and I said, look, we need to help these guys out, give them as much assistance as we can. That was sort of our goal. And they were really good about responding to me. They both took a liking to me, and we exchanged letters continuously. Seemed like every couple of weeks. So, and that lasted for many years. So we started. I told the guys, I said, look, when we lived in kind of a sprawling area, so everybody was from a few miles at least away from each other. So we covered quite a geographical area. And I asked the guys, has anybody heard anything in your area that's strange going on? And one of the guys said, yeah, that's out near the town of Roy, near Fort Lewis, Washington. And it's an area that's been long known for Bigfoot activity. And he had some strange things go on there. So I said, look, what's going on? He says, well, listen, the Clarks, they had a ranch out near Roy. And he said, they've been hearing a lot of weird screams going on out there. I said, well, get a hold of Clark, see if they'll let us go out there and maybe spend a couple nights on their property. So he did, and they said, sure, come on out. So we went there. We did our usual ride the bus to Paul's place, and with our backpacks, and off we went. We hiked up the tracks to their place, and they said, oh yeah, and they pointed out where the screams were happening every night, and they said, you can go out there. We're not going out there. So off we went. And, um, in those days, we weren't really well prepared. So we always seemed to have one flashlight with poor batteries. That was, we joke about it now. My co-host Tom and I, we joke about it. It's the never-ending, stories with we set up our camp. We had this old cabin tent that was, heavy canvas with no floor in it, and we started hearing screams. And there was one relatively, I'd say close, a few hundred yards, that was very loud, and another one maybe a quarter of a mile away that was answering. And this exchange would go back and forth for a while, then it would get quiet, and then pretty soon there was a time of year. It must have been towards spring, so there were a lot of tree frogs. I mean, it sounded like thousands of them around us. And then you would hear they would stop on one side all of a sudden, and the others were going, and then maybe to our front they would stop there. So this pattern would go around the camp until they were all quiet, and we didn't hear anything. We just heard them go silent, and then maybe 20 minutes later they'd start up again, and then it would be quite like that, kind of quiet for a while, maybe an hour, and then the screams in the distance would go on periodically. And then I guess around 10 o'clock at night or so, one of the guys says, well, I'm getting sleepy. What do you guys want to do about sleep? So I said, look, there's four of us. I think we should take turns, 2 on, 2 sleeping. So we chose our partners, and his guy didn't want to go to sleep. I said, all right, look, just go lay down, go to sleep. We'll figure it out. All right. We're young. We're used to staying up all night. So I said, we'll deal with it. So he's in the tent, and we're sitting, the three of us are sitting in front of the tent. The fire's right in front of us, right? So we hear him rustling around. And of course, being teenagers, we're making all kinds of lewd jokes about what he might be doing in the tent, right? And then as we're chuckling about this to ourselves, the tent almost gets torn down. Here he comes barreling, and he's a big guy. He's way bigger. We're a little skinny guys, right? He's a big guy, and his hair's all messed up, and his glasses are crooked. He's like, it's not very damn funny, you guys messing with me in the tent when I'm trying to sleep. And we kind of look up at him like, well, that would have been funny if we'd have thought of it, but we didn't think of doing that. So I said, look, what happened? You got to explain to me. I said, you sure you weren't asleep and dreaming? He said, no, I never fell asleep. I was listening to the conversation. I said, okay, well, if something really happened, then there has to be some kind of proof to back it up. I'm always very practical. I want to see the nuts and bolts. I'm not just going to take your word for it off the cuff. I want to see what's going on. So I said, okay, what happened? He says, well, I thought when you guys were reaching under the tent instead of coming through the door and disturbing me to get something out of the packs. I said, then? He says, well, then this hand grabs him. He was laying on his stomach, and he said his lower back right above his belt. He says, something grabbed me and started pulling me out of the tent. I said, your big butt, you think one of us are going to drag you out of the tent? He's like, well, no. I said, all right, look, if this really happened, you got to tell me from the heel of your hand to the tip of the fingers, where did the heel start and where did the tip of the fingers end up? And he shows me, and it was about 1.5 feet long. I said, well, now, I don't know about you, but none of us got a hand that big. So I told one of the guys, said, okay, bring the flashlight over as little as it worked, And sure enough, we found 18-inch footprints in this soft material going from the tent right behind where I was kneeling down. And there was this big bowl in the dirt where obviously a knee had been, and then these footprints leading back into the timber. So now we're wound out because we know what's there. And the circling of the camp continued on, and all this kind of ramped up through the night, and we kept going and getting more firewood and building the fire up big. And I think that kept them at bay, or they just thought these crazy teenagers were just going to get a kick out of doing this. I have no idea. At one point, we were so scared because of the screaming and all the stuff that was going on that all four of us were with our backs to the fire, facing all four directions, watching. And my buddy Milo, he wanted to tell me something, and I'm on the opposite side of the fire. So I'm kind of leaning my head back to listen, but I'm watching. And he turned all the way around to tell me whatever it was. So when he turned back, this thing was standing right behind the tent. And the tent was 6 feet high. It was at least 2 feet above that, and it was just glaring at him in the firelight. And he jumped, he yelled an expletive, and all it had to do was take a step backwards into the darkness, which is what it did when we all reacted. And we were just super amped up all night. Well, by around 4:30, 5 o'clock, we were exhausted. I think we all fell asleep shoulder to shoulder against a big spruce log, figuring we were going to fight it out if they wanted to come and get us. I think they just got bored. So I wrote John Green about what happened. And a couple of weeks later, he called. I got home from school and he called and he says, I'm in Seattle. I'm going to be down your way in about an hour. Can you take me out to the Clark Ranch? And I said, sure. So I called my buddy that lived out there. I said, hey, call the Clarks, tell them we're coming. And another couple of buddies came along. And to this day, one of them says, I didn't believe you knew John Green until I saw him at your house. So we all get in Green's VW van and out we go. We had no sooner stepped out of the van at dusk than the screaming started. And it was amazing how much was going on, how loud it was. And it was just nonstop, this loud screaming. And after a few minutes, Green says, well, I need to head back to British Columbia. So we loaded up in the van and we go back home. And I remember it was years later. Geez, I don't remember how many years later. It was 10 or 15 years later. I was at Green's house and we were sitting around, we were having lunch with Bob Titmus, and a couple of buddies of mine. And Green says, he looks at me and he says, I'm still kicking myself for not taking a recorder to that Clark Ranch. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. We made trips to Mount St. Helens. We found tracks there. For a bunch of kids, we did pretty good, finding stuff. And I would send pictures to him and to Hendon. And Hendon was a little more serious about it, but Green would say, oh, yeah, those are great pictures. Those are great tracks. Did you take it with a flash? Did you do this? Did you do that? Never responded, never came. So over time, I sort of started backing away from those guys. I mean, I stayed friends, Renee in particular. Renee and I, shared a lot of the same views, and he was more engaged, with what was going on. But I got disappointed, and especially their thinking was so rigid. I'd ask about, like food and these, and I was always interested in behavior, and they were so rigid in their thinking they wouldn't consider other viewpoints. So that's where I kind of began my split, and then of course. And I knew Krantz as well. Krantz was funny, and we got in an argument one time on the phone. I can't remember what about, but Renee came to visit from Bluff Creek on his yearly trip after this argument, and he didn't like Krantz. And anything Renee could do to stir Krantz up, he loved doing. So I'm grousing about this argument. I hadn't quite got it out of my system. And Renee says, "Well, they're having a conference. I wasn't going to go, but I should go." And I'm egging him on. I said, "Yeah, you should go." So he did. And it got filmed somewhere where he was just tearing Krantz up. So he calls me a couple of weeks after the conference. He's just laughing. He says, "Boy, I got that Krantz good." And that's the kind of guys they were. I mean, Renee had a great sense of humor. He was pretty tough on people, but God, he was funny sometimes.
I love to hear those stories because once you lose people like that, the Four Horsemen, the John Nagels of the world, once those folks are gone, you just lose that connection to this phenomenon that frankly I don't see very many people picking up the mantle and carrying forward.
No.
In my opinion, in the correct way. I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of things, but the way that they gave a very serious approach, different albeit in their style and the way that they approached it, I think those scientific minds are what's missing in my opinion in the Bigfoot community at large at this point. There's a few people that I have respect for, that are picking up that mantle. Jeff Meldrum's one of those people that I think is approaching it in the right way. But just in general, some of the TV shows and some of the things that are out there have just
There's some
destroyed
awful
it.
stuff out there.
Yeah, I mean it's just destroyed the community in my opinion. And go ahead.
And the bad part is they've got a following, and the more that stuff is divisive, the worse it gets. And I've been fortunate that I get a lot of really great contacts and a lot of good stuff coming in. I mean, I get flooded with stuff anymore, which isn't a bad thing, But yeah, when Renee passed away, a buddy of mine who also got to know Renee through me, because we would go visit him, we'd go celebrate his birthday with him, and we did a surprise thing for his 62nd birthday. Renee always liked little kids. He had a soft spot for kids. And I called him up and I said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He's, "No, I'm just hanging out, not doing anything this weekend." And I said, "Well, what do you think about my buddy Jack and I coming up to visit?" And he says, "Yeah," and I didn't let him know. I knew it was his birthday. And he says, "Yeah, come on up, and we'll sit around, have a couple beers, and we'll have fun talking." And so I had arranged for some other friends that had little kids and their wives, and they all made a birthday cake, and we brought a bunch of gag jokes, and we went up, and he had the time of his life. Of course, we gave him blow up dolls and stuff like that for his birthday, but after he passed away, my buddy Jack, he says, and Renee said something to me once, and I don't really, I mean, I always feel embarrassed to say it, but he said it. So we were talking one time at his place, and Renee was funny. The way he would talk. Sometimes we'd be joking around about something, and then in a second he would go, from joking to serious. I never saw anybody quite like that. He was so we were talking about stuff that happened in the Bluff Creek area, years before Patterson got his film. And it was always fascinating to me to learn what some of these individual details about the people who were there and the things that happened. So we were talking, and I was always kind of a history buff, and it really struck me watching him talk and listening to him. Friendship aside, I was struck by the fact that here's a guy that's a true pioneer in every sense of the word. He was a true pioneer. What we think about people in history as pioneers, that guy was one. And I told him that. And he stopped talking. He looked at me and he says, "And you're the last of us." How do you answer that? I'm just the guy helping out. You know what I mean? Um, we joked about our outlooks. He was Swiss. My family's from Norway, so both stubborn as hell. And that was kind of we laugh about that outlook about being stubborn, and sticking to our principles. And he said that, and I had no idea how to answer it. To this day, I don't know how to answer it. I don't consider myself that, but um, after he passed away, Jack says, "Hey, look, you're the only one left that knows a lot of this stuff." He says, "You need to start writing books." So I did, and I've got a few more in me, I think.
Well, I think you should definitely keep them coming, man. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the evidence that you've seen over the years and some of the cases that you've talked to people about. Are there any that really stick out in your mind as being like the best evidence you've ever seen or been able to examine, or any of the best encounter stories that you believe are that have really stuck out in your mind that you've taken over the years?
There's a few, especially recently, because I for those who are listening, maybe don't know, I have a podcast I call Creek Devil, and it's a three-part or a show, 3 hours long. And the first part, we try to have witnesses. The second part's usually a Q&A, and the third part, or we have somebody read stories. So that's basically the layout of the show. Sometimes we change it, but um, the witnesses who come forward have some really incredible things to say, and a lot of times it's helping them work through these really traumatic events, especially one that's fairly recent. There was a lady by the name of Carol, and we did a two-parter with her. And she talked about, and the one part, when you've done this for so many years, you think you've heard everything, and you don't. Somebody will come along, and I sit there listening to her. And a lot of times, I have Tom conduct the interview, and I'm examining it, listening carefully while this is going on. And occasionally I might say something, but it's more important for me to listen to what's going on. And then a lot of times I'll talk to the witness after we're done recording, and we'll discuss, ways that, they can work through these things, and I can help them with these because she's in a bad situation. And I've been asked for help from many places around this country and as far away as Australia, where people were in dire straits with these creatures and wanted them gone. Um, the one that really stuck out with me that she talked about a lot of stuff. And she talked about this older lady who came to her, and apparently people in the small town where she lives all know about these things. There's just a lot of bad things going on there. And it's not that far from Fouke, Arkansas, where the legend of Boggy Creek happened. So um, this lady apparently was knocked down by one of the creatures, hit her in the head. She passed out temporarily, woke up a second time. The creature was standing over her, then she passed out again. When she woke up again, the creature was down and had apparently opened her midsection, was eating her small intestines in front of her. And I got to tell you, I was in shock listening to that. All the things I've heard, and I get stuff from search and rescue teams. I get a lot of stuff that's very confidential, things I've seen that are pretty grisly. That one, that has to be near the top of the list. And there was another situation not far from here, for about 40 miles from where I live, just a few months ago, and I didn't think much of it at the time until after I heard Carol talk about this. And she's been knocked down by the creatures also, where a hiker was knocked down the very same way and knocked out. And first he said he saw a big man, then he recanted it and wouldn't talk about it. So a lot of times you'll see these parallels. When you hear something that's happened, and in my mind, I'll think, oh yeah, I can pick out, half a dozen different other accounts that had the exact same kind of behavior attached to it. So those things are always very interesting to me.
Yeah, it's one of the things I love about doing this show. I literally just interviewed a guy 2 days ago from Arkansas who's right outside of Fouke, Arkansas.
Mhm.
And it's like common knowledge there that these things
Yeah.
are around for generations, that they've experienced
Yes.
these things on their property. And
Mhm.
some of the amazing encounters he shared with me that'll end up on the show, I was just like, holy shit. I mean, this is like this plethora of information coming from this guy. And he's talking about it like you and I would talk about going to the supermarket. It's
Oh yeah.
just part
Yeah.
of the life and culture in that area. And it fascinates
It
me
is.
that you shows like Creek Devil and this show allow you to reach out across the world. Really, I just had an interview with a lady from the UK 3 nights ago who's had an encounter over there, and she
Mhm.
documents encounters over there in the UK. So I think these stories and these shows are some of the most important things that anybody can do, is collecting that anecdotal information and painting the picture across the country and around the world of the types of behaviors that people are experiencing, right? Because
Mhm.
you take all of that encounter, some of it it gets a little out there. We've all had those people we've interviewed that it's like a little far out there, and you're like, I'm not so sure about that. But I try to
Right.
take that information in and pick through what I do believe happened, and then present the information as it comes out in the interview. So I think it's a very important thing. And if you guys haven't checked out Creek Devil, I would definitely have a link in the show notes so you guys can go check out Will and Tom's show. It's a great show.
There's definitely a psychological component to it, and my original college training was anthropology and archaeology, but then when I went to Washington State University, it was a branch campus, so they had very limited degrees offered. So I chose psychology, so that's what I ended up going into, and it's actually been very good for what I do, because um, some of it is sifting through not just people's perception, but how they perceive and how they react to the world around them. And like you said, sometimes you're not quite sure about what they say, but then you when you do this long enough, you kind of pick up a sixth sense for it, whether somebody's telling the truth, and a lot of it has to do with particulars and those repeatable patterns. And there always are repeatable patterns, not just here but around the world. We've been talking to people lately from Australia. It was funny. We took a long time finding somebody, because I had a researcher there, then he dropped out of the subject, and we were trying to get a hold of some other people, and they were no longer involved or were interested in talking to anybody. And then all of a sudden, witnesses started coming forward because people were listening to the show there, and just incredible stuff. But the same kind of stuff we're hearing here, almost identical. And then we got connected with a group there that's very good at what they do, very good. And we share information back and forth, and it's great, having contacts with people like that.
Yeah, I love it too, man. I love the listeners in the UK and the folks in Australia. They're very interested in the subject, and they're having their own encounters and their own experiences over there.
And they're
And
very straightforward about it.
exactly, that's the other thing that I love about it. They're just cut and dry. It is what it is. This is what I saw, and I don't really know what that means, but this is I'm going to put it out there. I guess my last question before we close out for you is where do you think we are in the subject now? I get this over and over and over from people that I have conversations with that are skeptical and some cynical folks that say, we're no further proving that these things are real than we were in 1967 or 1950 or wherever you want to point the dial in history. Where do you think we are with the evidence, and where do you feel like we are in the definitive answering of the question, when are we going to prove these things are real and what they are?
You know, I think the majority of people who call themselves researchers or want to get involved in this are they're trying to be Roger Patterson. They're trying to be they're trying to go back to not October 20th of 67. They're trying to be the next day forward. That's what they're trying to be. And I have a friend who's a film producer in Hollywood. And we were talking about this just a couple days ago, and he says, nobody's really interested in film or pictures of these creatures anymore because there's so much today that can be faked, and most of what you see out there is faked. I have some pretty good pictures that I know are real, um, and I share them with friends sometimes and tell them, hey, don't share this out there because I don't have permission from the person who owns the picture to do that. But um, there's a lot of great stuff going on. I have a situation in Arizona, for instance, where we're getting hundreds and hundreds of tracks all the time. Every time the guy goes out there, there's a river bottom where there's a lot of catfish. There's a lot of food there. And you wouldn't think that with Arizona. There's a picture that a farmer took. Now he put a game camera out near this corral because they'd been having trouble out there. And lo and behold, and you can see on the game camera, it's 115 degrees, and here's a juvenile sitting in the water trough with its feet in the water, and it's back to the camera, and it's a nice clear picture. And we know the dimensions of the tub, so we can estimate the creature's around 4 feet tall if it were standing up. But it's sitting on the edge of the tub with its back to the camera, and its feet are in the water. Well, heck, I think if it was 115 degrees, I'd put my feet in the water trough too. But his tracks are anywhere from 3 inches to 20 inches where he's finding these, and we still haven't got a clear head count on how many are there. There are at least a half a dozen, maybe a dozen individuals there. So lots of great stuff there. I mean, we're finding where they're hanging, deer carcasses and trees, or they're doing all kinds of stuff there. Vocals. There's a vocal. I've got a Native American friend that I just interviewed recently in Alaska, and my guy in Arizona sent me this little vocal that he recorded, and it's a weird vocal. It's continuous, but it's got a few mixed elements in it where part of it sounds like an owl, then it trails off into this really weird sound. Well, he played it, and he's got pit bulls, and they're apparently mean pit bulls. And he texted me back, and he chuckled, and he says, well, I played it for the dogs. The dogs ran upstairs as fast as they could, and they went under the bed. And he said, I had a heck of a time getting them off from under the bed. It scared the dogs. And it wasn't just there. I sent it to Tom, and Tom's got dogs behind him that are annoying, and he played it outside, and the dogs shut up instantly. So, you know, and another vocal from a really good one from Tennessee just a few days ago from my guy there, and um, my forensic anthropologist friend. I sent it to him, and immediately he shoots back. He goes, "Wow!" He says, "That is definitely primate." And it's there's incredible stuff. Now, as far as the status of the subject, to be honest, I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon, other than where it is, because it's kind of a big mess. I hate to say that, but it really is. And a lot of people write to me and they're looking for answers, and I try to help build as many answers as I can. In fact, my current project for my book, I'm trying to get as many questions. I'd like to get about 400 questions for the book, and try to answer as many things as I can for people. So that's kind of the direction I'm working in with that. But yeah, I'm not too hopeful for the time being, to be honest.
Unfortunately, I tend to agree with you, man. I keep doing my show every week, and I try to do the little bit I can to put the stories out there that people are experiencing, and try to put my 2 cents in, and have people on the show that I trust and I think are approaching things the right way. And I've had some great people on the show recently. I had Shane Corson, Matt Pruitt, Amy Boo's coming up, and even Lyle Blackburn's coming on the show here in a couple of weeks. So I think those guys in their own way and gals are doing things, in my opinion, the right way. Amy Boo's doing Project Zoo Book, and she's putting together as many scientists as she can to really take a look at the subject and get the taboo out of it. It's kind of the John Bennernagel thing. He wants to take the taboo out of the subject, and I think Amy's sort of putting her foot forward and trying to do that. So I definitely try to support that as much as I can. Will, I can't thank you enough for your time, man. I've had a blast talking to you, and I really appreciate you coming on the show, man. It was an honor and a pleasure to have you on.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Good talking to you.
Absolutely.